The opinions or beliefs expressed in this podcast do not necessarily represent the opinions or beliefs of the Church of God or Lee University. For more information, contact Steve Hall at shall@leeuniversity.edu. Welcome to the Charismatic Contemplative Podcast, where the fast and loud embraces the slow and quiet.
Hey, welcome to the Charismatic Contemplative Podcast, housed here on Lee University's campus and sponsored by the School of Theology and Ministry. The idea of the podcast is the integration of the charismatic and the contemplative. We often say that it's where the fast and the loud meet the slow and the quiet. And we tend to think in this particular podcast, at least I do as the host, that both are better than standalone experiences. So we can be charismatic, fast and loud, but we would be benefited from some slow and quiet. Or we could be contemplative and slow and quiet, and we would benefit from some fast and loud. Think about it like you think about a transmission in a car. Who wants only fast gears? Who wants only slow gears? So the idea here is a complete transmission, a soul transmission, if you will. So we can move between slow and fast gears, quiet and loud gears, in order to bring the full complement and the benefits of the best of both worlds. Rather than one or the other, the best of both worlds, integrating the charismatic and the contemplative. And one of the most significant spiritual disciplines or practices of the contemplative tradition is Sabbath. But being a lifetime charismatic, I have really not heard very much at all about Sabbath in my life. So contemplatives experience it, but sometimes as charismatics, we think that contemplatives are probably acting like monks on Sabbath, where they're hiding away in solitude and silence and mumbling and muttering to themselves, and maybe some do, I'm not sure. However, I don't experience Sabbath like that. I'm a full-on charismatic. I love the fast and loud, but Sabbath brings something to the table that is unique, can be unique to the charismatic experience. So today I am thrilled to have two guests with me, Dr. Justin Walker and also Michael Utterback, and I want to introduce them to you now. So why don't you guys tell a little bit about yourself? Justin, you go first, and then Michael, you follow up. Tell us where you are now. What's
Fantastic. Thank you, Steve, for having us on for this podcast. As was mentioned, my name is Justin Walker. I serve as the Assistant Professor of Old Testament and Christian Ministry at Lee University. I'm going into my 6th year teaching there, and my primary ministry work right now is to train students for their work in the church and the world, and even for the academy as well. But of course, I serve in my local church and preach in various churches in the area, and but I really enjoy where God has me, and enjoy pouring into these students and future ministers.
Yeah, thank you, Justin. I appreciate that. Michael?
Well, Steve, same here. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today with you guys and to talk about this subject especially. It's wonderful. I'm the Director of Ministry to Israel. I've been living in Israel for about 36 years. We started a long time ago helping Jewish people get back from around the world. It was a calling that God placed on me back in 1985. And in 1991, when Perestroika took place, when the Iron Curtain came down, a lot of gray-headed folks know what I'm talking about. I think young folks, they go, that's in the history books. I read about that. But we were ready for that, and we started going from Warsaw into Ukraine and bringing Jewish people out. And we've assisted about 300,000 back now. In Israel, I have 5 centers across the country. We help somewhere around 25,000 Israelis that are coming back from around the world through our centers with the benevolence and all types of things like that. And I could go on and tell you all of the details of it, but anyway, that's basically what we do in the nation of Israel.
Excellent. I love these podcasts because I am always inviting people that have subject matter expertise that I don't. And so I'm learning constantly. And so, I'm a pastor, and for 38 years, I've preached plenty of times out of the Old Testament, and I've preached plenty of times out of Psalm 23, and I've preached plenty of times out of the Ten Commandments and all of that, and the Decalogue. but I am not an Old Testament expert by any means. I've never been to Israel. Michael, have you been to Israel?
Well, it's about, have you been to the United States? Because I'm a resident of Israel.
You really are?
Yeah.
How many times have you been there?
No, I live there. I have a home in Jerusalem.
Okay.
And I'll go next week back there. I'm starting to make a change now. We're moving our center of life back to the U.S.
Okay.
But for all these years, I've spent probably 7, 8, 9 months there, and then traveled around the world, speaking in different places. And sharing about Israel and God's plan for the nation of Israel.
And so I of course knew a bit of that. I didn't really know you were a resident there. That's amazing. I mean, having someone that has been there is one thing, visited for a week or so, but someone that has lived there, and I'm assuming, and as we've talked, of course, you've lived through Sabbath, so Shabbat.
Oh yeah,
So
many times.
You know what it's like to be in Israel itself, in Jerusalem, and experience it in real time.
Yeah, from experience, and I'm anxious to hear you guys talk about, from the biblical perspective about Shabbat as well. But mine is more experiential.
Yeah, it's fun when I'm talking to you because you're always using the word Shabbat and I'm always using the word Sabbath, and so that's always a curious distinction.
Right.
But somebody that's a resident of Jerusalem, I imagine you would say Shabbat. Yeah. Now, for me, Justin, the fourth commandment, the Sabbath commandment, is contextualized in the 10 commandments. And so give us some insight into the context of the 10 commandments, where it fits into Scripture, what we can expect from it, what we are required, what it requires of us. Sure. Give me some context of that, and then we'll dig a bit deeper into that fourth commandment.
Yeah, so let's start with the Decalogue context first. So
the Decalogue is the same thing as the Ten Commandments, right?
That's right. So the Decalogue, in the Reformed ordering, it is the fourth commandment. In other numberings, it's perhaps the third, but it seems to wrap up what we call the first table. So if the first commandment, the greatest commandment, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and strength, might be reflected in the first 5 or 4 commandments. No other gods, no idols, no misuse of God's name, honor or keep the Sabbath, depending on if you're reading in Exodus 20 or in Deuteronomy 5, and then honor mom and dad, as it were, dad and mom. Yeah. So these become refractions of how to love God. The fourth, therefore, becomes a means of honoring God, or a primary way of instantiating that within time in a weekly rhythm. So it's important in that regard, of course. But at the same time, Sabbath seems to be the first commandment given in 2 respects. It's the first commandment given in that after Israel is rescued from Egypt, before they get to Sinai in Exodus 16, the first thing God tells them to do is to gather manna only 6 days a week. And the 7th day, they're supposed to rest from doing so, gathering 2 days' worth on the 6th day. So this is something, the first commandment that Israel receives after being rescued from Egypt is to rest on the 7th day. And so many have said, therefore, that there's something about Sabbath being first in time that reframes all the other 9 of the commandments as an expression of and as a living toward that rest, such that God's yoke indeed is easy and God's burden is indeed light. That, in fact, they're not even called 10 commandments. They're called the 10 words, which of course has commandment as an implication of it. But it's a way of God saying, not merely you're supposed to do these things, but rather a way of God saying, this is who you are, right? You used to be slaves in Egypt. You don't know who you are, but you're my people. And the first thing that you must know is that I'm not Pharaoh. I don't require you to make bricks for the building of my kingdom 7 days a week without straw. But instead, I'm a different kind of God. I'm a God who first prioritizes rest in the reception of your life, not the making of your life, Israel. And of course, the prologue is important in the 10 Commandments as well. Before God even gives a commandment, God says, I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. As a reminder to say, even your keeping of Sabbath is a response to and a living in the rescue that I've already provided. But if we dig deeper into the commandment, what's interesting about the fourth commandment, it's the longest of the 10. Yeah. It gives the greatest justification for it. And of course, there's 2 different reasons. One from God's mouth in Exodus 20, and another from Moses' slight revision in Deuteronomy 5 in the plains of Moab. And in Exodus 20, the reason is that it's rooted in the rhythms of God's own work in the created order. What's interesting about Genesis 1 and 2, however, is that Sabbath is not just the means that God ends the story. We often assume that God works for 6 days and then it's done, and seventh is God's kind of exhale. But in fact, the language says that creation isn't complete until Sabbath is instantiated, such that rest is a part of the creative act itself. And what's interesting as well, if we could draw it all out, right, it seems as though God's making a house in Genesis 1 and 2, such that the whole world becomes a tabernacle for God's presence. But more interesting than that is that on the seventh day, we've heard the first 6 days, there was evening and there was morning, the first day, the third day, the sixth day. So every day, therefore, of course, as we know in the Jewish tradition, every day is a movement out of darkness into light, right? Out of chaos into order, out of decreation or uncreation into creation. But on the seventh day, at least in the biblical witness, there is no evening, which is intentional on the parts of the author, right? It's this wink unto the reader, or at least this subtle indication, perhaps, that Sabbath isn't just how the story begins. Sabbath is also where the story is going. Genesis 1 is a vision, not just a memory of what was, but a vision of what will be. Because there's no darkness in the seventh day, it becomes this trope that's picked up in the prophets, like Isaiah, which speaks of when the end comes, right? When the day of the Lord comes and after the great judgment, there is no need for the sun because the glory of God is the light of all things. There's no darkness at the end. And so therefore that weekly remembrance of Sabbath unto the Lord, which is key. So it's not just a day for self-care, which we can talk about, but this weekly remembrance becomes a means of looking back to the rhythm of the created order, living in the rhythm of that created order, and looking forward to the Sabbath rest that belongs to all creatures. Deuteronomy 5, however, Moses changes it. You observe a Sabbath unto the Lord, keep it, because you need a day to remember the fact that you were once slaves in Egypt. And therefore, the Sabbath becomes a means not only of remembering the goodness of God, who is our rescuer, the better ruler, right? The one who is anti-Pharaoh. But also, it becomes a way of ensuring that you don't become Pharaoh. Because it's not just you, Israel, that gets a day off, but everyone in your house, including the slave in your house, gets a day off, and the donkey gets a day off too,
animals, right?
And so everybody participates in a Sabbath, such that God doesn't just want a day as his, as if God were some kind of selfish, egotistical, maniacal something. But instead, God says, no. You need to remember, one, what I've done for you. Yes, that's key. But this is a day to remind you of what you've come from and what you are not, which is you are not first and foremost workers or doers. You are those who are my people, and that's good enough as an identity to carry.
Yeah, I love what you're saying, because it sounds like you are helping me reform my vision of the Ten Commandments out of, okay, here's 10 rules I've got to keep, as drudgery, as imposition on me from some divine creator. And you are really stating that the 10 Commandments as a whole are really designed to, I guess, create distinction between most ancient Near Eastern religions and the Jewish tradition or the Israel tradition with God. This God is different. This God is unique. Am I hearing that correctly?
Yeah, right. There's something, too, about God resting on the seventh day that shows that God is not restless, not restless. God is not anxious about God's created order. There's nothing that threatens that order. God in Genesis 1, unlike many of the stories of Israel's neighbors, is vulnerable and open as God makes the world, such that God allows created things to create from themselves and invites them to do so. Let the seas teem, right? Let the plants reproduce their own kind, be fruitful and multiply, which is God's way of saying from the beginning. It's kind of take your kid to work day a little bit, right? It's kind of God opening up the creation from the beginning, and in opening that creation up, God still rests, which implies therefore that God is not like other deities. God need not slay the world into existence. Chaos does not threaten God. Chaos is the raw material from which God makes something beautiful. And Sabbath is the end result. Isn't just the after-dinner mint, right? Isn't just the bowl of ice cream after all that hard work, but is the telos, is the thing for which all things remain.
I like. Tell me where I'm going with this. Help me discern this, because I've always seen this story of creation as God wore himself out with the first 6 days. And then he was so exhausted, he needed a day of rest. But then over time, it's realized, wow, that crescendo of creation with humanity coming on the scene. And then all of a sudden, their first full day as humans, as living beings, they rest with God. Not like God needs rest, but he's, I guess, modeling or showing, like, out what I'm getting, what I'm commissioning you to do can only be done out of rest and a sense of fullness rather than wearing yourself out in exhaustion.
No, that's right. And that, therefore, it's not that Sabbath is the day off from the other 6 days which take priority.
Oh, that's good.
But it's instead that Sabbath reframes work such that all work is a working from and a working toward the rest of all creatures.
Yeah.
Which is why Israel uses the Sabbath in its scriptures, not just as that weekly rhythm or practice, but Sabbath becomes the ideological and theological foundation for all justice practice in the world. So that sevenfold principle becomes later, right? In the book of Deuteronomy, for example, in Leviticus even, right? That 7 years, every 7 years, debts are canceled, slaves are released, the land gets a rest.
Are you saying this emerges out of Sabbath?
It's almost as though, I think it's more deductive than inductive, which is to say, I think Sabbath is the governing umbrella that has weekly instantiations as its guarantee, or at least as its consistent practice, but the practice is reflecting the broader idea more than the broader idea is moving out of the weekly practice, at least in terms of the way that the ideology and theology is framed, such that by the time you get to Jesus, Jesus embodies Sabbath rest in his own ministry. This is, he's proclaiming the year of the Lord's favor, such that his ministry is Jubilee, which is the Sabbathiest Sabbath, right? Every 49 years.
Sabbathiest. I love that.
So the year of Jubilee is when God hits the reset button on society. Everybody who is landless gets land back. Everybody who's enslaved in debt slavery, those debts are canceled, and all right relationships are restored. And Jesus, by proclaiming the year of the Lord's favor, which is quoting from Isaiah, of course, in his first sermon back home, is a way of saying, I am the Sabbath. My ministry is to inaugurate the year of Jubilee. Hebrews takes this up, and Sabbath therefore becomes eschatological. It's the Sabbath. It's the direction toward which all things are moving as that rest has already arrived in Jesus Christ by his Spirit. And so what Jesus is doing in his ministry is not necessarily, of course it's new, but it's not foreign to Israelite thought or Jewish thought. And so therefore that weekly kind of remembrance of Sabbath, and therefore the remembrance and worship of the Lord, is participating in broader Sabbath structures in the world, such that Israel is building, by the power of God and God's command, a just society where all creatures, not just all humans, but all creatures are flourishing.
Yeah, thank you for helping reframe work.
Sure.
You said Sabbath reframes work. We're working from rest toward rest. And I love that vision. Fantastic theology. Michael, how does it really work out in Jerusalem? Does it seem to work out like Justin's describing, or is it has it become different over the years? And what do you see?
I mean, I don't think most Israelis sit and think about the theology of why they're doing what they're doing.
Yeah.
You know, they come from all kinds of countries. The last few hundred years coming back to the nation of Israel, and they bring their traditions with them and the things that they've done. To me, and it fits right in with what you're talking about. It's relationship, that it's relationship with family, and it's a relationship with God. And so whenever we have Shabbat in Israel, it's more like that. I mean, we begin like on Sunday night. By the way, I can't go down the road and tell you everything theological about some of the stuff I'm going to talk about, and that's where you come in, Justin. It's fantastic. I have sat here and learned so much,
me too.
and I've been around this for quite some time. But the theology you laid out right there is absolutely wonderful, and I appreciate that.
Thank you.
My first experiences when I first started going to Israel, I was just like the normal everyday Christian guy, and
from the West.
Yeah, from the West, right. And my experiences with that, it was like, you do what? you'd go into a home and by the way, my first thing was being in an apartment in Jerusalem and having some Orthodox folks above us. Mm-hmm. And one of the first things they told me when I parked my car was, by the way, I mean, they're really open and they tell you what they think sometimes. You don't move that car, do you, during Shabbat? They thought, oh, no, I wouldn't. No, we won't do that. So they laid down the rules.
Wow.
But I got to know them over quite a bit of time, and then we were able to spend time with them, during Shabbat. But there are things like an elevator. You're not allowed to get on certain elevators and push a button on Shabbat because you're striking fire. And it's one of the laws and the traditions of Judaism. And if you go in Israel, you go to any hotel, they've got a Shabbat elevator. And
really?
That when you get on that, and if it's an 18-floor hotel, you stop at every single floor. So you don't have to push that button. So these are experiences that I didn't know about until I got on a Shabbat elevator and wondered, what's wrong with this thing? And I kept trying to hit the buttons.
You kept breaking Sabbath.
Over and over again. And another thing is the Shabbat Goy.
The what?
The Shabbat Goy. I'm a Goy, as a Gentile is called
okay.
the Goy. Goyim,
Okay.
which we're called Goyim. If they have a problem, they look for a Gentile to maybe help them out. And if they know you, well, they came down and knocked on our door before.
Yeah.
And they said, would you come upstairs? And so you know what's going on. Uh-huh. And the pilot light went out. So they're going, and you're walking around looking to try to figure out what they want you to do.
Okay.
And you notice the pilot light's out. So you say, oh, your stove's not working. So you see the matches over there, you go over and light it for them, and then it's like, oh, thank you so much, because they're not allowed to do that either.
Wow.
That there are so many little traditions and things that you don't know as a goy, as a new person in it. But it's fascinating because it brings the family comes together. I mean, the first thing that happens when you sit down at the table, and I've been at many different tables and had different experiences, but is the lighting of those candles by the mama.
Yeah.
And when she lights those candles, they're just something so special. It's like it's an invitation. Come Shabbat. And most Israelis long for Shabbat. They just look forward to it. Well, Shabbat's only 3 days. I mean, if you're not going to see somebody on a Thursday, you'll always say Shabbat Shalom. Even though it's going to be 2 days from now, you'll say Shabbat Shalom because you might not see them again. So you're looking forward to it. So the mom, she lights those candles, and then she does this and puts her hands over her eyes, and then she opens her eyes up. And from my experience, what they're doing is they're closing their eyes to the last week of the week and then opening up to Shabbat. And that's the first thing she sees is the lights of Shabbat. And that's how it begins. And then there's the prayers and the different things that they do at the table. Some of the things I really love, of course, there's a lot of rote and a lot of reading in that type of thing. And sometimes it just becomes normal, and it's what we do all the time. But when it comes time to pray for the children, I love that one because they always bring the kids around and they pray for them, thank God for the last week, and always look forward to the next week. And that basically is that's how that starts. It ends with thanking God for what happened, and then talking, Rebecca's going on and she's in the 7th grade, Father, and we just need for you to help her through what's going on next week. And she's got a test on Wednesday. And it's really like that. And it's looking forward to that and praying for each one of them, and may you become like certain patriarchs and so on.
So I hear you saying the Sabbath Shabbat for, real Jews in Israel is a looking back and a looking forward.
Exactly.
It's an opportunity
Yes.
to reflect back and forward.
Yeah, you once were slaves, and now you're not.
Yeah.
And so that begins the Shabbat. And in the natural now, it is dark. I love what you're talking about. It's light, and I see that. I love that.
So you see it in the practice.
Oh my, yeah.
Clearly.
Yes.
Wow.
There's a longing for it. And then the next morning, they're walking to synagogue. It's all quiet. And that's the one thing I notice about Israel is the quiet. It just on Shabbat it's so quiet. I mean, you can hear the birds and you hear people talking and they're walking together, and they go to synagogue and they come out peaceful, and they come home peaceful. Well, I live in a city where on Friday, some folks go to a mosque and they come out mad, and they're angry,
wow.
and you have to be careful on Friday going down to the old city or being around that. But when it comes to the Jew, they come out peaceful, and there's just a sweetness about it. And, 7 out of 10 Jews in Israel would tell you that they're secular. But they still have a Shabbat meal. It's interesting that most of them still will have family, and they'll be together. The next morning, they might not run off to Shabbat like Granddaddy or the others do, but they'll take their family and go somewhere. And they're so family-oriented. So, again, it's relationship.
Okay, so Shabbat in Jerusalem, whether you're secular or whether you're not secular and you're faithful, Orthodox Jewish, it's about relationship and it's about reconnecting the family. I hear this theme of recalibration. Like there's this resetting of self with Shabbat.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And, when you're in Israel, it's like you go to Jerusalem to pray. You go to Tel Aviv to play, and you go to Haifa to pay. It's very industrial up there.
Okay.
Tel Aviv's the party city, the Miami of, it's wild. But Jerusalem is set apart in the sense that it's very religious. So my experiences with Shabbat has been more in Jerusalem than anywhere else.
Yeah.
But I do know that all over on Shabbat, people will go places and spend their time with their families, and they're so family-oriented. You see, everywhere you go, you see the dads pushing the cart with the babies in it. And it's just amazing, the relationship between family members, especially on that particular day. There's just something in the DNA that just yells, rest and be with your family.
So I'm hearing you describe some ritual and practice where everything stops. Is there a certain time on Friday that it just stops?
Old ways, of course, how it was. They'd light fires, and then the guys on another mountain would light a fire, and they would know all the way to Babylon when it was Shabbat, because they did this all the way across.
Yeah.
Nowadays, it's in the newspaper, or if nothing else, you see 3 stars shining in heaven, unless it's cloudy. But it's in the papers, it's on media, and you know exactly when
Everybody
Shabbat
knows
begins.
when Shabbat is.
Exactly, at the second.
So there's this full stop, this quietness, this silence, this sense of family, this relationship, reconnection to God and each other. But I am hearing you say that many are secular with regard to this, and they're keeping it out of culture or tradition. When you hear Michael, Justin, talk about they can't push elevator buttons and they can't strike fire, that seems incongruent with this principle, free-flowing, relational, non-restrictive. It seems different. It seems restrictive on one sense that I'm hearing Michael describe it, but free and open. And are you hearing the same thing? Or?
Well, they don't mind doing it. It just becomes life. It's what it is. And I agree that you can get a little overboard with things like when you go to a meal, it's either the meat or the milk. In a restaurant, so there's that. You can't, if you sit down in a meat place like a pizza place and you got meat, you can't sit over where the milk guys are. Eating cheese and that kind of stuff. So, it gets a little bit pushy and you
rigid.
It's very religious in a sense, but
perhaps But I think also, as speaking as outsiders, I think it's better to empathize with the tradition and learn from it than to think. From the outside, that looks strange to me, so it must be incongruous with what we've seen in Scripture. I think rather, perhaps we might begin to say that we're erring toward, if we want to see delight and discipline as somehow contradictory or non-mutually informing forces, then the discipline seems to get in the way of the delight. But I think it's instead the case, and many have said this, but I think I'm drawing upon Abraham Heschel's work here on the Sabbath, Jewish thinker, scholar, theologian, wonderful thinker in that regard. But he sees the two as mutually complementary. That is to say, so to delight in the concept of Sabbath without any of the discipline, rigorous work of actually keeping it is to not have the Sabbath at all, precisely because it's not merely internal to the self. It's not merely a kind of fleeting thought for the Jewish practice Saturday afternoon or the Christian practice Sunday afternoon. We could talk about that. But instead, it's the discipline is the means of living into and unto what Sabbath looks like in the concrete here and now.
What you're describing, Justin, is so perfectly oriented to what we're doing here, because we're talking about charismatic and contemplative integration. And you just described discipline and delight. And for many charismatics, discipline in their spiritual life doesn't necessarily equate with delight. And on the contemplative side, the delight of free-flowing, free-wielding, unscripted, charismatic worship doesn't jive with discipline of the contemplative practice. And I love what you're saying, that these things are not mutually exclusive. Rather than disintegrating discipline and delight, what if we integrated discipline and delight? And perhaps one of the best places to work with that is in this sense of Sabbath.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, while you're talking about this, my thing is about the Jews coming back. How did they live for 2,000 years, close to 2,000 years, out in the diaspora? What kept them?
What's the diaspora again?
Oh, the diaspora is when the Jews were driven away from Israel, and between 770 A.D., 135 during the revolt, and then after. They were driven to the nations, which God promised if they didn't obey Him that would be what would happen. The miracle is that they stayed Jewish, and that they were able, after all that time, to still identify themselves. One of the things that I feel that kept them was the discipline of Shabbat. And all through, they would not break the Shabbat everywhere. I mean, they didn't have a land, they didn't have a leader.
You mean the fourth commandment was so precious to them that they retained it, even in, quote, exile or the diaspora.
If they didn't have the disciplines, they wouldn't have lasted.
Wow.
But those disciplines are what, exactly.
That's beautiful.
And so that's why they're where they are now, back in their land.
Yeah, I love that. Speaking of discipline and delight, Justin, help me understand the Ten Commandments, and particularly the fourth commandment, in context of this idea of being binding. So can you talk about that a little bit? Because, I mean, me and my charismatic friends or evangelical Protestant friends, non-Jewish friends, are like, hey, that's a Jewish thing. That's not binding for us, so we don't have to do any of that. And it's almost like we just are unshackled. So can you talk about that?
The relationship between the Ten Commandments generally, or specifically, and the law generally, and Christian practice is a complicated one. I think there's all kinds of general frameworks we use to talk about Jesus perhaps fulfilling the ceremonial and the civil, but not fulfilling the moral, but only the moral applies to Gentiles, etc. But those are kind of lately introduced constructs that don't quite fit either the warp and woof of the text or kind of generally speaking Christian practice. So as it pertains to Sabbath specifically, is Sabbath binding upon Christians? Well, no and yes. Okay, so complicated in that, so whom does God address in the Ten Commandments? Well, of course, Israel God addresses in the Ten Commandments. But we know originally when Israel leaves Egypt, they leave as a mixed crowd. So, and there are Gentiles in their midst because there are certain laws that apply to the foreigner or the alien residing in you. Okay, so maybe that includes us, maybe it doesn't. Later in texts like Isaiah 56, foreigners and eunuchs are welcomed on the basis of especially their keeping of Sabbath. Okay, so now all of a sudden Sabbath is incumbent or at least possible or open to. Okay, so it's complicated. It's not necessarily straightforward. In Christian history, as, of course, Jesus changes the map, doesn't change, as Jesus is Israel's representative in Christian theology, and is Sabbath incarnate, if you will. Then as Gentiles are now grafted into the people of God via the work of Jesus Christ, Gentiles are not required to keep seventh-day Sabbath according to books like Acts, in Acts 15, for example. It's not. In fact, Paul discourages it in books like Colossians, that you're using these holy days as a way of implying this kind of closeness to God in a way that's unnecessary because Jesus is sufficient for the incorporation of the Gentile people. So then what happens? They begin to celebrate the Lord's Day, which is the first day of the week in light of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And in the celebration of that day, as the primary revelation of God's new thing in the world, God's recreation of the world, creation 2.0 has been kind of birthed in the midst of the old via the kind of first fruits of Jesus Christ's resurrection. Then that starts to accrue Sabbath-like practices, so that Sunday starts to become not just a day of devotion to the Lord, which already looks like Sabbath, but starts to incorporate elements of rest within it as well, which is where we get things like all the way fast forward, right? All the way to things like Chick-fil-A being closed on Sundays. That's a terrible overview of history, but nevertheless.
There was something in between?
That's right. So, that brings us back to, I think it's, I don't want to say irresponsible. I think there's something not quite right about Christians both attending church on Sunday and treating that as the day of rest for the people of God, and also appropriating Jewish customs on Saturdays. There's something that doesn't feel right about that to me, that feels more appropriation. I'm not saying it's wrong if people are doing that. Everything's contextual. I'm just saying it's not incumbent upon Christians to do a seventh-day thing and then a first-day thing.
I think I hear you saying that when Jesus spoke of, hey, listen, you weren't created for the Sabbath was created for you. Help me understand how that fits into binding or not binding.
Yeah, that's even an intra-Jewish conversation itself. So Jesus is adjudicating, and of course, Jesus is reorienting Sabbath around its life-giving, healing properties and purposes. And so, I think at the same time, Christians ought learn from and submit themselves to the God of Israel, of course, who is the God of Jesus Christ, but learn from our Jewish friends and recognize that on the first day of the week, which is the Lord's Day, a day dedicated to the Lord, that to incorporate disciplined elements of rest and remembrance and forward-looking, to recognize the importance of those kinds of things. So freedom and obedience together.
Discipline and delight.
Discipline and delight, that's right, the alliterative version. I think there's something to be, received insofar as our mothers and fathers have taught us that Sundays, there's a reason that the Sunday afternoon nap is a better nap than all the other
it's
naps.
Sacred,
That's right. So I think there's something to Sunday being the church's day. And that also ought to include elements of remembrance and forward-looking that recognizes that I am not what I do, that my life is not self-made, that this is a day dedicated to not stressing about what I didn't get done yesterday and have to do for tomorrow, but that God has always been the one that gives me my life and is my sustenance and breath and provision. And it's not just a day to take a nap and watch a movie, but it's a day ultimately to gather with the people of God to worship that God. It's a Sabbath to the Lord, as the fourth commandment tells us. So are we under it? Yes, but only insofar as we are grafted into the people of God and remain non-Israelites. We are not Jews.
Would you say there's a distinction between the understanding of binding or not binding when it comes to things like adultery, lying?
Oh, sure, of course. Yeah.
So it seems like we easily, in the Protestant world, adopt all those binding commandments, like not taking the Lord's name in vain and not stealing and not committing adultery. But Sabbath, we tend to take it or leave it, no matter what.
Yeah, I think that's partly because the New Testament affirms all other 9 commandments in some capacity.
Yeah.
Sabbath, it affirms in the person of Jesus Christ and reframes as eschatological reality and reframes around Jesus as Sabbath himself.
Yes.
And then the other 9 are also reframed in light of Jesus. Everything points to him and moves from him. That's the New Testament paradigm. But Paul explicitly, for example, in Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, especially that second table, and not just in the Sermon on the Mount, several places the 10 appear. Sabbath, however, seems to be one that's radically reframed, especially insofar as we retain our Gentile identity, even as we are grafted into the people of God who are Israel/Jewish.
Yeah. So it is binding but not binding, and we're kind of playing with that a little bit in that understanding that we have some freedom in it, some recognition that it's different. Jesus reframes it now. So Michael, help me understand, do you use elevators on Shabbat when you're in the States?
Yes, I do. I use elevators in Israel. They always have two. One for the sinners and one for the saints. And
sinners and saints.
Oh yeah.
Okay. So if your pilot light goes out on Shabbat,
I just relight it.
Tell me how you import your own Sabbath understanding to your world here in the States, or as a Protestant, as a Pentecostal. How do you work Sabbath in your own personal life?
Well, because I've lived so long in Israel, Saturday has always been a very special day for us.
Okay.
Even if we don't go to an Israeli home, we'll still have a Shabbat meal, and my wife lights the candles. We just love that tradition.
Yeah.
I pray for the kids, and I pray for what God did before and after. But it's not an obligation; it's a joy. Okay. And everything that's a joy in Shabbat, that's what we do.
That's really good.
And when I come to the States, there are times when I can't do that. And so I just go on about my business, and if I felt the Lord checking me, then I'd stop and go, wow, what am I supposed to do? I've never sensed the conviction, not condemnation, but the conviction of the Lord telling me, wow, why didn't you do this or why didn't you do that? Never.
But, when you say do this or do that, do you mean like rules and regulations
the
about
rules
Sabbath?
Of it, right.
Okay.
Yeah, because if it's like that, I don't think I would enjoy it.
Okay.
Well, we have to do this now. Everybody get here. We got to pray, and no, not going through the road, but the joy of it. And usually, if I have an opportunity on a Saturday, I have a place where I go. My wife and I, we're together, and we do all kinds of stuff together. But I'll go down and sit and just read, and numbers of times I fast. I'll just seek God. It's my day when I be by myself and I can fast and pray. And so those are things that I do because I want to. I don't feel compelled to do it. And I appreciate what you've said about it's in Jesus, because that's the relationship is where the rest is. That's where the Shabbat is.
I love that.
And it strengthens. I get strong after a Shabbat. I just feel strong, and I'm ready for the next thing. I don't know. Amazing. Sometimes we talk about Sunday being a Sabbath, but I think for pastors it's anything but a Sabbath. Right. Yeah. I mean,
how can pastors rest on Sunday?
I've never envied a pastor. I pastored a few years. Yeah. I remember back in the day when it was Sunday morning and Sunday night, and you wanted to watch the Miami Dolphins play, or whoever else, and you can't, because you got to get ready for that. So you're over there slaving away, getting ready and whatever. I never really enjoyed it as a pastor. Now, watching you guys slave away, I don't mind that so much as an observer.
Well, I appreciate that. I love to have people come watch me work on Sunday.
So
I love that contrast. So the idea is that you, Michael, would see perhaps even a blend of both, that you really own that day of rest as Sabbath, but also you celebrate this Lord's Day on Sunday, where you gather with worshipers.
Right.
So you have this almost best of both worlds experience.
Right, but I don't look at others and say you should do this or you should do that. Yeah. And I think that's where you go wrong with it, is when we start demanding others to be like that. And I've been in way too many congregations around the world where they've gone to the legalism, Gentiles, trying to be Jewish. And you said it earlier, just trying to be Jewish. And doing everything, carrying the Torah around and doing all the things that they do in synagogue. That's not who we are. We need to be who we are, and we are Gentiles who love a Jewish Messiah, and we're grafted in. We're part of the kingdom, and if you're Christ and you're Abraham's seed and heirs of the promises, we also are adopted into those promises as well.
Wow.
But we can't. I will never be Jewish. I can't be, but I can serve them, and that's my role.
I love that. I mean, I'm hearing so much blend and again integration here. When Justin, you say that this Jesus is the fullness of Sabbath, the ultimate incarnation of rest and Sabbath, and then Michael, I hear you saying that the expression that you're talking about on a Saturday is the external expression of rejuvenation and rest that is joy in Jesus. You have the Sabbath, Jesus, in you, but you represent externally that internal Sabbath in your Saturday.
That's what I meant to say right there.
Well, I was feeling it when you were
great.
saying it. In my own way, as this, amateur Sabbather, if you can call that, or that I have for about 15 years now, as a charismatic, loving the delight, the freedom, the joy of worshiping like a charismatic and the unscripted stuff. I enjoy all of that, but also taking seriously this sense of rest where I recover and rejuvenate and restore myself, where I let the Lord lead me into the green meadow, and I let Him lead me beside the quiet waters, and then I start feeling this restoring of my soul and leading me in the right paths for His name's sake. I start feeling that shepherding sense when I consistently practice Sabbath for me, which when I was a pastor, it was Thursday sundown to Friday sundown. It was just my regular routine because Saturday was full of weddings and funerals and events, and then Sunday was a heavy work day for me. So finding that sense of externally representing rest that is internally experienced in Christ was Thursday to Friday. But now, working here at Lee University, I ultimately go from Friday sundown until all the way, right now for me, it's 36 hours. It's all the way through Sunday after lunch, after church. So I blend this Sabbath and Lord's Day into that sense of silence and solitude, or being with my wife and going antiquing. She likes to go antiquing. We do things that are restorative. Sometimes I do little household projects that bring me joy and restoration. I do lots of reflection, classic Christian literature reading, and then ultimately end up on Sunday going to church and worshiping with the people of God. And then after lunch, I'm back to kind of work. So that, for me, that's how it operates. So as we really recognize that charismatics and contemplatives can focus on discipline or focus on delight, but what if we could integrate that together? Do you think charismatics struggle? Why do we struggle with Sabbath? Why do we seem to not recognize it or preach about it or declare it or invite it into our work? Why don't you think we as charismatics tend to engage that? We talk about thou shalt not commit adultery. We talk about thou shalt not lie, thou shalt not steal. But we don't have much to say about carving out, as Heschel would say, that sanctuary of time.
That's right, yeah. I'm not sure. I think part of it pertains to its kind of stickiness as it pertains to the law in general. We don't know how to kind of navigate things that are ceremonial.
Good, yeah.
Okay, so that's part of it. But I think also Sabbath, in the words of Brueggemann, just kind of runs up against the broader socioeconomic Western impulse.
That's so true.
And that drive in a way that, okay, yeah, we'll respect kind of personal boundaries as it pertains to murder, adultery, stealing, coveting, etc. But there's something about telling me to slow down. I think that's problematic, but also that flies in the face of certain economic practices that are harmful to ourselves, harmful to others, certain drives for more, et cetera, that I think Sabbath is not just an individual thing, it's also a communal thing. We're individually minded people, we're not communally minded people. And so this is one of those that involves and invokes the entire people of God and not just what I do with my own personal time and body, money, etc.
Yeah, let me throw this in here for a second.
Please.
Pete Scazzaro talks about Sabbath, or actually talks about the Pharaoh of culture,
Yeah.
shaming us into busyness. More bricks, more bricks. More. Are you talking about one of the reasons we as charismatics is because, well, we're also capitalists and we're also consumers.
That's right.
And so therefore we struggle with this cultural Pharaoh shaming us in the business. We always got to go. We always got to achieve. Am I hearing you say that?
Yeah, and our spirituality, as it's often conceived, is often excluding the socioeconomic practices and preferences of our world. So I think we think our spirituality applies to our money, our time, our bodies, etc. It doesn't necessarily apply to capitalist systems of consumerism and all those kinds of things. And so to place a kind of obligation on that area of our lives is probably a kind of life audit that makes us uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And therefore
It's
it's
a
only
great way to
it's
say
only
it,
practiced
life
as a kind
audit.
of go to church and take a nap, which there's something to going to church and resting. That's important.
Yeah, not a bad
But
thing.
seeing how Sabbath calls into question all the problematic aspects of our consumeristic culture
That's so
is something
good.
that we often don't want to address.
Again, we talked earlier about Sabbath being an opportunity to recalibrate and to reflect on ourselves, reflect on our God, reflect on our deliverance, reflect on our future restoration of all things. I'm really liking that. So as we wrap up, give me some last parting words. Like, how would you look at the people that are watching or listening and say, hey, charismatic, hey, contemplative, here's my exhortation for you. This is what I would hope you're taking away from this discussion. So,
Well, just kind of piggybacking on what we were just talking about here, I think we're also a product of the last 1,800 years of Christianity that has tried to separate itself from the Jew.
wow.
And Shabbat is one of those things that was laid down in 325. We don't do that anymore because that's Jewish and we're not Jews. And so then the fathers picked that up and taught all the way through the centuries that Shabbat was no longer necessary. We don't have to be like them. There was some truth in there, but it was to separate themselves from all of things Jewish. We're watching now something coming together where the body of Christ, since Israel was born again in 1948, people coming back from around the world, now we've come into the reality that God didn't throw the Jews away, and they're watching them do what they're doing. And I think the Holy Spirit is moving in us, especially in the charismatics, that there is somewhat of a restoration of that relationship between the two entities, between the Jew and the Christian. And so we're watching those things, and we're sitting at tables like this, talking into microphones, asking questions about, are we supposed to be doing what they were doing? Because the early church did, and the Gentiles were celebrating Shabbat all the way through, as you know very well. So I think we're now grappling with, and I love it because it's the Spirit of God that's pulling us more to where we have to talk about these issues. And I don't know that there's a conclusion at this point in time. But I would say to anybody that's listening that if the Spirit of God's dealing with you to deal more or to delve more into it, do it. Listen to the Spirit about those things. Rest. Because in reality, that's where He's pulling you, is to get to that place where you have a deeper relationship with Him. If it's a Shabbat, do a Shabbat. If it's praying for your kids, having a meal, do that. I mean, you can institute things that they're doing that'll bring your family so much closer together because that's what kept them together. And so if that works for them, why can't it work for us?
Whether a charismatic or a contemplative, one way that we can converge in unity with a Jew, although we might not keep Sabbath perfectly as they would keep it in certain ways, but we can have some sense of commonality to say, hey, we believe in Sabbath as well, and we have a point of commonality there that we can come together with rather than separate. So maybe Sabbath and more charismatics and contemplatives, Protestants, evangelicals, Christians doing it makes it easier for Jews and Christians to get along.
Yeah.
as they
new
do.
man.
One new man.
That's what this thing is all about.
Yeah,
And
I love that.
I mean, of course, I've been dealing with this for years and years,
Yeah.
but I've been watching that happen over a period of time where we're both coming together.
Both coming together.
And I think that Shabbat's just part of this, the things that we're
Yeah.
discussing now. We deal, in our side of, they deal with a lot of the disciplines and a lot of the legalisms and that type of thing. We can influence them that there's spirit. I mean, there's law and spirit.
That's beautiful.
And, you know, Mount Sinai was the law and Pentecost was the spirit.
Yeah.
And so you have both mountains, but they're both equal. They mean something.
Zion and Sinai, yeah.
Exactly. And so what we're seeing now is that law and spirit coming together, and I think the influence is on both camps.
Yeah.
That's we're influencing them about.
Beautiful.
I mean, they're jealous, honestly, of us loving Jesus and the way we worship and the things that we do. It just blows them away.
Yeah.
And so this is a good time spiritually, I think, on this planet. I know there's a lot of things going on. We're dealing with a lot of issues, but one is that God is bringing this thing together to bring one new man to himself.
Fantastic. Justin, anything final?
I think just bringing us back to Sabbath as the first word and Sabbath as the last word of all creation, I think is a helpful reminder that in the Christian practice, getting the kids together, getting everybody dressed, running out the door to get to church by 10:30 or 9:30 and singing a couple, 3 or 4 songs you've sung 600 times before, or you're learning all over again, and hearing a sermon that you like or you don't like, and greeting the people that drive you crazy or that you love more than anything in the world. But that kind of 2.5 hour, 1.5 hour, 70-minute, whatever the case might be, that practice has as its goal not merely that practice, but it's a living into and unto. That somewhere in the midst of that concrete reality, as the presence of Jesus is manifest in his faithfulness and grace, there's a bringing back to not just the moment that we first met him or not just the moment that we were delivered, but the first word.
Yeah.
We weren't created to just make money and live the life script. But that you were created to rest the rest of God, as John Levinson says.
Love that.
And that, therefore, has as its core that you must also be one who offers rest. So your work is a rest-offering work. Your work is working toward the Sabbath, not just for yourself, but for others. And so it's a dress rehearsal for the end, just as it's a reenactment of the beginning. And so if we could just reframe what that every kind of rote Sunday morning thing can become, I think it starts to take on, that discipline starts to take on greater delight, we might say.
Yeah, I love that integration. And Sabbath reminds me consistently that I want to be a place of rest for people. That I want rest in God, my Sabbath in Christ, but I want people to find my presence restful. Hey, thank you so much for joining us on the Charismatic Contemplative Podcast, where we've been talking about Sabbath and how it can apply to the charismatic and the contemplative, and that there's integration and overlap here. There's discipline and delight in this particular practice. And so I want to encourage you to experiment with Sabbath. And if you're interested in more resources related to Sabbath, feel free to go to ministryoasis.com, a totally free site with all kinds of content there regarding Sabbath and resources for Sabbath. So I want to encourage you to consider doing that. From Lee University, the School of Theology and Ministry, thank you so much for joining us today. God bless you.
The opinions or beliefs expressed in this podcast do not necessarily represent the opinions or beliefs of the Church of God or Lee University. For more information, contact Steve Hall at shall@leeuniversity.edu. Thank you for joining the Charismatic Contemplative Podcast. May your fast and loud embrace the slow and quiet. It's not either or, it's both and.